There is a disease in this world called inequity. If a new COVID variant emerged from a person living in a country of low availability to healthcare, would we not be affected by the COVID pandemic again? COVID 19 vaccines have been proven effective against COVID 19 and the variants that fuel the continuation of the disease. More people would have died from COVID 19 or have been hospitalized without the vaccine. However, vaccine inequity is causing people in developing countries to be unable to get vaccinated. Some challenges include education, income, race, color, or access to health care. According to the World Health Organization, people who are not vaccinated are at higher risk for new COVID variants. People in developing countries are experiencing COVID vaccine unavailability, which is a major source of the persistence of COVID 19, with the new variants emerging, and steps need to be taken to improve access to quality vaccines for people in all countries. My name is James Buck, and I have had interest in COVID 19 vaccines since early on in the COVID pandemic, at which time I started doing research on COVID vaccines. My first research paper addressed whether Pfizer's COVID 19 or natural immunity was more effective at preventing COVID. My second research paper addressed Pfizer's COVID 19 vaccines development and incorporated some of the ethical concerns regarding the vaccine development and its function. For this presentation, I hope to persuade more people to receive a COVID 19 vaccine and to advocate for equal access. Vaccine inequity is causing an ongoing emergence of new variants that fuel the pandemic. Steps should be taken to improve access to COVID vaccines in developing countries. Although there are some downsides to the COVID vaccines, the benefits outweigh the con, and perhaps the new emergence of variants will subside with increased availability of the vaccines to everyone. So, what is one of the main drivers of the ongoing pandemic? Vaccine inequity is the lack of equal access of vaccines for everyone. As to COVID 19 vaccines, they were distributed mostly to developed countries, but developing countries lack the necessary access to COVID vaccines, but leaving poor people more prone to having severe COVID. According to the World Health Organization, most vaccine manufacturers decline the opportunity to share their technology with other countries. Vaccine companies were also not setting up contracts to increase the supply and to help deliver the vaccines around the world. COVAX is a vaccination program dedicated to delivering vaccines to countries all around the world, and the African Vaccination Acquisition Trust, AVAT, is a 10-member organization dedicated to securing vaccines for all the countries in Africa. According to Global Dashboard for Vaccine Equity, compared to higher income countries who only need to increase their healthcare spending by 0.8%, lower income countries need to increase their healthcare spending by 56.6% so they can vaccinate 70% of their population. In other words, lower income countries with limited funds need to pay a lot more money to cover the cost of vaccinating most, if not all, of their people against COVID. This problem arises from the lack of support for the worldwide vaccination programs, including COVAX. COVAX provides a sharing mechanism to vaccinate 20% of the country's population, but still leaves a burden on low-income countries due to the lack of support for donation from vaccine companies. This leaves most of the low-income people unvaccinated, which can lead to more COVID problems moving forward. The longer more low-income people are left unvaccinated against COVID-19, a risk for a new emergence of more variants that could have potential threat to the entire world continues. the World Health Organization emphasizes that new variants of concerns means that people in certain countries had increased risk for infection from COVID. The new variant of concern then would circulate the entire world, affecting even developed countries like America and the UK, leaving people in poor income countries unvaccinated due to financial problems also slowed down worldwide recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic will just keep persisting if the steps are not taken to improve the access to COVID-19 vaccines in all countries, regardless of economic or social status. With the problem of vaccine equity in mind, how are we, as global citizens, going to solve this dilemma? Governments and companies need to take steps to resolve the vaccine inequity issue by creating and sending in contracts for COVAX and the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust to provide enough supply of COVID vaccines that higher income countries to countries in need. They need to get rid of their export restrictions, and they need to make a pledge and to fulfill their pledge to increase the vaccine supplies while bearing the quality of the vaccines in mind. As more countries donate COVID vaccine doses to support COVAX and AVAX, poor countries, especially Africa, will be able to have a better supply of vaccines to immunize a greater percent of their population. According to my research, more contracts for COVID vaccine supplies, poor countries will not have to pay more for vaccines than richer pay for vaccines already if more contracts were in. In addition, if more countries fulfill their contracts while keeping the COVID vaccine quality in mind, then poor countries will receive better vaccines, thus they will be able to immunize their people, reducing the chance that new COVID variants will emerge. Finally, if countries remove restrictions on exports of COVID vaccines, then more COVID vaccines would be able to reach low-income countries in a quicker amount of time, and more people would be immunized from COVID-19, and the emergence of COVID variants would decrease. The steps to increase the availability of vaccines are important because not only will more people be immunized, but fewer variants will emerge and the COVID pandemic will more likely end. According to my research, during the first rollout in the December of 2020, high-income countries were able to vaccinate 70 to 80% of their population, but low-income countries were able to vaccinate fewer than 10% of their population. Statistics by Medicine Sans Frontiers show that if COVID vaccines were more evenly dispersed, then 1 million deaths would have been prevented. In addition to that, Delta would not have emerged in India and Omicron would not have emerged in South Africa. While you may think that there would be no downside to solving the vaccine inequity, there are few to consider. COVID-19 vaccines themselves have health risks that could affect the world population. According to the National Institute of Health, there is a risk that vaccines, especially mRNA vaccines, could produce type 1 interferons, which could lead to inflammation or autoimmune diseases. This could place the world population at risk of developing autoimmune diseases if the vaccines are not researched sufficiently. Another downside of vaccinating the world population with the new COVID vaccines is that there were not enough animal testing to ensure that mRNA vaccines are as effective to preventing COVID-19 as companies say they were. These downsides may not be helpful over time as they could worsen the situation with not just COVID, but with a new wave of autoimmune disease or a lack of immune support from vaccines. Like, while the vaccine may have some downsides, the vaccines given to the people in high income countries proven to be effective so far, and the benefits outweigh the cons in reducing the severity of COVID. And the steps should be taken to immunize the world from COVID anyway. Taking steps to solving vaccine inequity is important regardless of circumstances, especially with COVID-19. First, governments and companies need to support COVAX and AVAT with quality doses of the COVID-19 vaccines with contracts. Second, companies need to keep their promise to deliver quality COVID vaccines to ensure that people in poorer countries are able to be immunized with safe and efficient COVID vaccines. Third, countries need to remove export restrictions to allow more vaccines to reach poor countries so more people can be vaccinated and against COVID, and the time for new variants to emerge will be able to be decreased. Imagine if a new variant emerged and was able to evade vaccines just because vaccine companies were careless in simply handing vaccine doses to the low-income population to be immunized from the virus, and that economically and socially ruins billions of lives. The steps I have outlined are not without shortcomings, but perhaps lowering a death rate could lead to the classification as COVID-19 as a pandemic is worth considering. Vaccine inequity is causing an ongoing emergence of new variants that fuel the pandemic. Steps should be taken to improve access to COVID vaccines in developing countries. Although there are some downsides to COVID vaccines, the benefits outweigh the cons, and perhaps the new emergence of variants will subside with increased availability. People in developing countries are experiencing COVID vaccine inequity, which is a major source of the persistence of the COVID pandemic, with new variants emerging, and steps should be taken to improve vaccine equity for all countries. If you want to be able to go on nice vacations, eat out at your favorite restaurants, or be able to return to a more normal lifestyle without having to wear masks all the time, please do your part in helping solve the COVID-19 vaccine inequity. Please write to your congressperson to solve the vaccine inequity crisis. Thank you for taking the time out to listen. I hope you understand the truth behind why this pandemic is persisting and to interfere with your lives and the lives of billions.